Welcome back, young scholars. Those are a set of traditional woodblock prints from Japan featuring Mount Fuji. And so in this video, we'll be discussing Japan, both in period 3 and in period 4. So the big questions you should be able to answer after watching this video are: first, how did the Chinese influence Japan politically and culturally? Second, how was Japan organized politically and socially? And third, how did Japan's view of Europeans change over time? In response to that first big question, how did Chinese influence Japan politically and culturally, you may recall from a previous video how Japan used China as a model for their own government, that they established an emperor that was based on the traditional Chinese view of the emperor as having power given by God. So from the 12th to the 16th century, Japan kind of falls apart politically, and it develops into a decentralized feudal society. Lots of large landholders, known as daimyos, are going to control various private armies. There's going to be basically a constant state of civil war in Japan from the 12th to the 16th centuries. In this period, Japan's women are going to exercise more power and influence than women elsewhere. So if we're trying to identify some of the differences between China and Japan during this period, whereas women were having their feet bound in China, women in Japan, again, were exercising a little bit more influence. And this makes them similar to women, for example, in the Mongol Empire, and women in West Africa, who also had a little bit more influence in terms of political decision making. Now, in terms of their social characteristics, Japan again has this emperor, much like China. However, a big difference is in Japan, that emperor during this feudal period was just a figurehead ruler. The emperor had no actual real power. The real power was vested in the hands of the real military leader, who was known as the shogun. So the shogun was both the political and military leader in Japan and was the most powerful single person. However, during this feudal age, most of the power resided in this group, the daimyos, right? These local feudal lords who are going to control these large estates and who build these castles. Ultimately, because it is such a warlike society, there's so much conflict going on, they need protection. And the protection that they get is from a class of people known as the samurai. So the samurai are these Japanese warriors. Their duty is to provide defense and protection. There's this whole code of behavior for samurai called Bushido, where they were the only ones in society that got to walk around with two swords, one long sword and one short sword. And if they were ever felt slighted, they would engage in a duel, and if they ever lost that duel, they would have to perform what's known as seppuku, the ritual suicide practices of these samurai. So below the samurai are the peasants or the farmers. They provide the food, again, in a society that is feudal in nature, meaning where central authority does not exist, and people ultimately have to have their basic needs met, like protection and like food. These are the types of classes that you oftentimes see, just like what we saw in Western Europe following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the medieval age. Now, at the very bottom of society, we have merchants, because remember, Japan is oftentimes following the model of China. They were heavily influenced by Confucian values, and remember, Confucius does not like merchants, and therefore China placed merchants at the very bottom, and so too does Japan. In 1603, there is a shogun named Tokugawa Ieyasu, and there's a very complicated long backstory to this. But the thing that you need to know is that Tokugawa Ieyasu is going to unify Japan through both military power and diplomacy. And this is ultimately going to usher in a long period of stability and centralization for Japan. So this is known as the Tokugawa Shogunate. So a shogunate is a state controlled by a shogun, in the same way that a caliphate is a state controlled by a caliph, and a khanate is a state controlled by a khan, and a sultanate is a state controlled by a sultan. Tokugawa Ieyasu is going to set up a bakufu. A bakufu is another word in Japan that basically means a tent government. It was supposed to be temporary, right? The shogun was supposed to maintain temporary power until ultimately the emperor was able to reestablish control over the region. But this Tokugawa Shogunate, this tent government, is going to last for about 250 years. So a significant period of time, starting in period 4 and then moving into period 5. The point of this government in some respects, is just to provide some control over these various daimyo, these 270 feuding warlords throughout Japan. And so he does a number of things, Tokugawa Ieyasu does, passes a number of laws and regulations to try and control the daimyo. For one thing, he limits the power of the daimyo by requiring all marriages to be approved. And so at this point in world history, the predominant way to create alliances, which ultimately give you a little bit more power, is through marriage. The shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu also required the daimyo to live in Edo essentially every other year, and that's for a simple reason, right? You want to keep your friends close but your enemies closer. And he wanted to make sure that he was maintaining oversight over these daimyo to prevent any possible rebellions from really beginning. So it is in this Tokugawa Shogunate that we see power concentrated in the hands of a single ruler, very similar to the kind of absolute power that we're seeing concentrated in the kings in Western Europe and the czars of Russia. And this, by definition, kind of results in these wealthy landowners. They're going to lose some of their powers. So, for example, in Japan, it's the daimyo. In Russia, it's the boyars. In the Mughal Empire, it's the zamindars, whose power is going to diminish with the increased concentration of power in the hands of the shogun. Now, in terms of cultural characteristics for Japan, many Japanese practice traditional Confucianism and also Buddhism as a result of the Chinese influence. Now, Buddhism is going to look different in Japan than it looks in China. Remember, Buddhism started in India. Initially, there's the kind of Theravada Buddhism that spread across Southeast Asia that's more consistent maybe with the original teachings of the Buddha. By the time Buddhism gets to China, it turns into the Mahayana form of Buddhism, which is far more spiritual and far more about people being able to attain nirvana in the afterlife. And then we get to Buddhism in Japan, which is known as Zen Buddhism. So we see these Chinese influences, both in terms of Confucianism and the way in which they structure their society so that everyone has a part to play and a role to play, but also in the belief in Buddhism. Many Japanese, though, continue to practice animistic religions, a polytheistic religion that involved ancestor worship and worship of spirits in nature, and this is known as Shinto. It's not surprising when you really think about the geography of Japan that they took on some of the cultural characteristics of China because of their close proximity to China and China's relative power, but also because they were geographically isolated, because they were an island, it makes sense that they maintained some of their own cultural traditions from really as far back as period 1, which is what Shinto really is. In period 4, with the arrival of Europeans, not surprising, we're also going to see the arrival of Christian missionaries. So Christian missionaries, especially Jesuits, Catholics, were initially accepted in Japan because there was some interest by the Japanese shoguns like Tokugawa Ieyasu in trade from Europe and technology. Remember, Japan is one of those places with silver, and so Europeans like the Portuguese and the Dutch are heading to Japan to try and extract that silver from the Japanese so that they could take it over to China to trade. And so there was some initial interest by the Japanese in establishing good trade relations with Europeans. And also, there's then some success in establishing some diasporic communities in Japan made up of Christian missionaries. However, over time, the shogun views Christianity as being a threat to the status quo within society, and they begin increasingly persecuting Christians, oftentimes through very brutal, tactics. For instance, they would crucify those Japanese who had converted to Christianity. So they booted the missionaries out, and then those Japanese that refused to recant their religion were persecuted. Japan is also going to, in period 4, and as we get into period 5, implement some xenophobic economic policies. So they are going to limit all European trade, with the exception of only the Dutch were allowed to trade at Nagasaki. So the Dutch, who were bringing goods to Japan, like guns and other technologies, were still allowed to trade during a very short window, period of time every year. And so Japan is going to increasingly turn towards xenophobic economic policies, right? Fear of foreigners, shutting the country down. And they did this by not allowing any Japanese to leave the country, nor did they allow any Europeans to enter the country, with the exception again of the Dutch, mainly because the Dutch were Protestant Christians and were less interested in converting the Japanese than Catholic missionaries like the Jesuits were. Now, initially, Japan during the Tokugawa Shogunate is actually going to experience a period of kind of initial prosperity because, again, we're seeing the end of the civil war, this constant state of warfare. And so the population is going to increase, food production is going to increase. But as a result of these more isolationist economic policies, we're going to see Japan eventually kind of losing out on all the blessings of cultural diffusion, of all those technological advancements, and then ultimately going to be falling behind to the point where in period 5, we're going to see the United States show up and demand that Japan begin trading again with the Admiral Matthew Perry. So as a result of watching this video, you should be able to answer these big questions. How did the Chinese influence Japan politically and culturally? How was Japan organized politically and socially? How did Japan's view of Europeans change over time? Thanks for watching. Welcome back, young scholars. Those are a set of traditional woodblock prints from Japan featuring Mount Fuji. And so in this video, we'll be discussing Japan, both in period 3 and in period 4. So the big questions you should be able to answer after watching this video are: first, how did the Chinese influence Japan politically and culturally? Second, how was Japan organized politically and socially? And third, how did Japan's view of Europeans change over time? In response to that first big question, how did Chinese influence Japan politically and culturally, you may recall from a previous video how Japan used China as a model for their own government, that they established a emperor that was based on the traditional Chinese view of the emperor as having power given by God. So from the 12th to the 16th century, Japan kind of falls apart politically.